Hello everyone and welcome to the first episode of Adventures Elsewhere Reviews, the spoiler-free book review show. I am your host, Jay Black, and today I'm going to be talking about an indie book, as I usually do. At this point I would usually hold up the paperback, but alas I read the ebook of this one, so I can't. This is A Spectre is Haunting Greentree by Carson Winter, who is an author I hadn't heard of. So this is a very typical read for me and a very typical read for the show. This is an adult horror. It's very short, it's 120 pages, I really like this sort of length. This is an indie press book, this is Tenebrous. So I like to give my overall impression of the book in about 3 words. So impression at a glance at the start of these episodes. So I would say the 3 words I'd use to describe this book are terrifying. Genuinely, this book is genuinely scary and you're not going to hear me say that often. It's a massacre. The body count for 120 pages is nigh on impressive. And the 3rd word I would use is grim. It's genuinely just quite a grim, dark book. So, this is just right up my street. It's the exact sort of thing I like to read. So first and foremost, I like to start with characters, and there are quite a lot of characters in this book. I'm going to start with our main POV character. This is Karina. The vast majority of the book is from her POV. She is not the sort of character I'd usually enjoy having as my POV character. She's quite meek, quite demure, I guess is quite a good word for her. But that's just because of the sort of backstory that she has. There's a lot of hardship, there's a lot of trauma in there, and it's just sort of moulded her into this person that she didn't used to be. And she doesn't particularly like that this is who she's become, and she's trying to set out to be more assertive and more independent. That's what she wants. And I do like that she recognises that she's not happy with who she is, even though this is very naturally who she'd become through her backstory. There's a good reason for her being the way that she is in the beginning. It's not just an excuse to write a meek, demure woman because that's what the writer thinks women should be. No, there's a reason, and she's not happy, and she's trying to work on that. And I appreciate that as a character arc. It's very natural, it's very normal. Without going into spoiler territory, she does change a fair bit as a person, but doesn't lose actually just being a nice person despite everything. Now moving on to a character who is very much not a nice person, let's talk about Steve. Steve has some chapters of POV early in the book, but this dries up about around the midpoint, but very cleverly so, by the way. Steve is Karina's ex and just a terrible person. Through and through, he's just horrible. And so getting into his head and how the writer does this in narration, and it genuinely embeds you in that and the sort of person that he is, and it's just kind of gross, and I appreciate that, again, things aren't shied away from. This is just a terrible man, and reading from his POV is unpleasant, as it should be, and I like that. But I don't know that I can talk much more about Steve without nudging into spoiler territory, so I'm going to switch into Hazel, and Hazel is one of my favourite characters in this book strictly because of her relationship with Karina, sort of in the latter stages. Let's talk about who she is on her own first. So she is the daughter of a couple of Karina's friends, so they sort of meet because of that, and she is 16, give or take. She is, on the outside and at first, a fairly sort of archetypal, stroppy teenage girl, but you come to realise very quickly that she's very clever, actually, and she's one of very few people in the town who actually really knows what's going on, and she knows without having to be told. She figures it out on her own, or as good as on her own. Simply, and she's already like most of the way there, is the impression I get, but then there's one incident about the third halfway through that really has all the pieces slot together for her, and so thinking back as you're reading, it all sort of lines up that you see that. She's clever, and the actions she takes later back that up. She's very decisive, she's very assertive, she's very independent, and Karina looks at her and thinks, I wish I was more like that. I wish I could be more like her. And they end up spending time together partly because of parental socializing, but also Hazel works at the same place that Karina later works at, so they end up spending time together because of that. And they end up forming a genuine friendship between, and it's quite an unlikely sort of friendship, I think, that you get this woman who's in her 30s and this woman and this sort of teenage girl, late teenage. And it is just a sort of genuine, quite supportive friendship despite being very different people. And they joke and they rely on each other at different points, and you know, they make jokes at each other's expense and all of these sorts of things, and it's quite natural, it's quite normal, and I like that unlikely friendship, actually. I think that's one of my favourite things about this book. So since I've mentioned Hazel's parents, let's talk about Emily and Wilbur. And you get quite a lot of different views of them in the book, which is quite interesting. So the first sort of look at them you really get is in an amount of flashback sequences in Karina's POV. She's thinking back to their wedding and thinking about how perfect and how idealistic the two of them are and how the wedding is the same. And it does come across that way. But this is about, give or take, 10 years before the main quest of the book, the main plot. The next time you see Wilbur in particular is after this time break. And at first, Karina's still thinking, oh, these two are so perfect, it's so idealistic, I wish I, looking at them. But if you're really paying attention, even in the very early stages of seeing them again, you can tell something's changed. Something is a bit different to how they are now as opposed to how they were at the wedding, and there's some tension there, and things are maybe not going so well, and maybe Emily's just keeps saying they are to convince herself, and it's quite uncomfortable at points, actually. And the way that sort of ends up going isn't really quite what you'd expect, I don't think. Just the exact nature of what happens and how it happens it's not what you'd think. I can't say much more about this without getting into spoilers. And the next and last character I wanted to highlight, I really can't say much about without spoilers, but this is Larry. And Larry very much comes across as this quiet, hard-working man. And in many ways he is, and in many ways he isn't. There really isn't much I can say about him other than that he is, again, he's a very interesting character. The thing about the characters in this book is they are, again, all complex. They talk to each other very naturalistically, but often naturalistically stilted. And the personality does shine through very quickly, very easily. You know, these are well-crafted characters, they've had a lot of thought put into them. I think all of them have stuff under the surface that you don't see coming until it comes, a lot of the time. So moving on from characters, because I have spent a while talking about characters, usually I'll talk about pacing about this point, but I don't really have a whole lot to say on this one, besides pacing's great. I mean, it's 120 pages, it's tight, it's been edited well to be tight. I think this is the thing with works of a sort of slightly strange length when it comes to things that are about 120 pages that doesn't really neatly fit into any box, is they're just done to be the length that they are, and you can tell, particularly with this one, that it's not written to any sort of word count goal or anything like that. It's just the length that it is, it's done nicely. So since I touched on editing quality, let's touch on writing quality now. Let's talk about that. First and foremost, I think the thing that really stood out to me with this one as I was reading it is the strength of the description. And I'll always admire writers who can do this because this is one of the things I struggle with most. Descriptions in this are absolutely excellent. They use language really, really well. And I've actually got an example from the book. It's talking about the facade of a building, and it's pink. And that's the first thing you're notified to, is that it's pink. You think, oh, pink, that's nice. But the pink is then described as a combination of milk and blood. That's not so nice all of a sudden. It's just like, there's a lot of stuff like that where it's just like, oh, this is no, this place isn't nice. Which, is fitting because Greentree is not very nice, actually. Even in, like, there's a lot of language that's very evocative, and there's a lot of use of language around death and around blood where it's not strictly necessary, it's just worked into descriptions and into narration in the sort of way that I showed you. And I really appreciate that. It's the sort of making every word count. And I really like when writers do this. I think it's really valuable. And it's just done really well here. Also, the sort of sentence length, and this isn't something I would usually talk about, but the sentence length and rhythm is done really nicely in this one. There's an almost sort of staccato horror to it, and I really like that. And maybe this is just me being such a big horror fan, such a big horror reader, dark lit reader in general, really, that I do just really like good staccato sentences like that. I know this isn't always popular, I've seen a lot of people say quite the opposite over the years, but I don't know if this is just a reading preference thing as to what you read. Since I touched on descriptions, let's talk about world building and sort of lore. And this is a contemporary setting. This is sort of set in a town called Greentree, which is in Oregon. There's actually a lot of detail about how the town came to be founded. It's all very relevant, of course, because it's also relevant to the main. And I guess there are sort of two antagonists, depending on how you cut it. It's quite hard to call that, actually. There's a lot of detail on how the town was founded, and how it was actually quite a good idea in principle, but the execution was just really, really bad, actually. What happened because of that, and how that still, to this day, affects the happenings and goings on. I really like having that there. I mean, I like history in general. I've always had a big interest in history. Not, I like historical fiction, but just sort of having that touch in there of history, I just thought that was fun. I thought it was interesting how, trying to skirt around spoilers, it almost ends up being sort of wrong place, wrong time. It's, in many ways, a lot of people are just really damn unlucky in this book. Because things have been building for a long time, and yeah. Also, I want to talk around the scarecrows in this point, because a lot of the stuff that's done with the scarecrows is genuinely just really creative, and also, this is where the genuinely terrifying part of this book sits. In the author's note in the back, the writer talks about how scarecrows are underused in horror, and as someone who has read a lot of horror, especially this year, I've read like 15 plus horror books by the time I'm recording this. I've not come across scarecrows in horror before as anything more than just a sort of background scene setting element. If even that, to be honest. On a balance of probability, I suspect I have, but they've never played a big role in any story I've read until this one. So much is done with them, and so much. It is so clever. I really can't say much about it without spoilers, but I have to say I agree with the writer. Scarecrows are underused, and used correctly. Yeah. One thing that comes across quite strongly through all the lore, through various aspects that you hear about throughout the book, is the idea of greed and of con men, effectively. This actually becomes a very big theme in the book, is people's greed and the sort of scams and cons that happen in everyday life, not even just like the big stuff that's going on in the town, but even just the sort of everyday little things people do to get ahead. This comes up quite a lot, and it's sort of interesting to see that in a story that's not massively political and it's not really massively about corruption or anything like that. It's not really a background element exactly. It does come to matter quite a lot, but to sort of have that there as a facet of horror almost, that's an interesting take that I've not come across before, and I did like that a lot. I mean, another big theme in this book is abuse, and there are a couple of different types that are handled in this. So abuse of power, to sort of go with the greed and cons and all of that, though that's there much more so. And there's a sort of combination of all of those things and how people abuse their power, and that was handled in a very realistic and interesting way, I thought. But there are many kinds of abuse that come up in this book, and again, it's not shied away from, and I appreciate that. Not much I can say about that at all without spoilers. So I think the main theme that comes up in this one, and this is mentioned in the author's note as well, is anxiety and trauma and how that affects what's going on, and how that can turn moments that are just very normal, quite innocent, into something very different. And I really like that. I really like how that's handled as well, and the sort of just being in an old house at night and what that can be like, and how differently different people perceive that, because there are multiple people that go to this place, so they all experience it quite differently and talk about it differently. It's sort of interesting how Karina, someone with this incredibly difficult backstory and all this anxiety and trauma that's come from it, how at times it's the paranoia that goes with that is so completely correct, but at other times is so completely wrong that in a way she becomes quite unreliable, and you're not quite sure what to believe and what not to. And I think it's almost impossible to read this book for the first time and call everything correctly. I'm willing to say that is damn near impossible. You expect her to be right about some things, but then she's just not. And this story isn't the one you expect it to be, really, at any point, with how any of the characters go, with how any of the plot threads go, and they're set up at the beginning. You end up expecting it to be a particular type of story, and it doesn't really matter how you try and cut that, you're going to be wrong, which I really like. And I think that's sort of the most unlikely part of the story, and I didn't really get this until the very end, is the whole idea of the final girl, and how Karina is this very unlikely sort of final girl of this story. And I didn't think that was the sort of story I was getting with this book. I didn't think this was going to be the sort of final girl idea. But I really like how this was done. This isn't a trope I usually like. I usually think, oh well, it just gets a bit too ridiculous, it gets a bit too ludicrous, a bit too plot armor-ish. But that's not what happens here at all. She's wrong almost as much as she's right, if not more, to be honest. She gets a lot of things wrong. And she doesn't handle a lot of things very well. I mean, what she does on the doorstep a couple of times, yeah, that's not someone who's good at handling things. It's interesting to have as a final girl, because if you think about the final girl trope, and the sort of character that comes to mind with that is this incredibly badass sort of character who's a sort of, I don't know what another term for this is, but it's almost a man-at-arms who can fight with anything, and is very quick, is very sort of athletic, is clever, is assertive, is all these things that Karina is not. She's not really any of these things. And yet she ends up in this sort of position. And it makes a lot of sense. At no point do you question how she ends up in the situation she's in, because it just makes sense, actually. It's done very naturalistically, it's not done in a plot armor way, it's not done in a sort of, oh no, I need her to live, actually. There's definitely none of that, because the body count in this book, I mentioned it at the top of the episode, but yeah, I mean, this might have more on-page deaths than the first book in Project Suncloud. Which is saying a lot, and this is a much shorter book as well. This book is there's a massacre in this town. And again, I don't want to give names or get into spoilers on this one. It's the sort of, it starts out with people being, with a couple of deaths. You know, a couple of people get picked off. And then suddenly just the heavens open, so to speak, just out of nowhere, and I was like, okay, that escalated quickly, very quickly. And there's one particular family who you see pretty late on, and what they do is it's a moment that stays with you, let's put it that way. Also does leave you wondering, even after the end of the book, not everyone is dead, and it's not just that Karina is alive and everyone else is dead. Like, there are people still alive, but you can't help but wonder, how long for? Is everything actually over, or is it just that Karina's left it behind? I'm not sure, who knows. You can get the, sort of from everything I've said so far, the tone of this is, it's pretty scary, this book, just in the sense of, it's not one looming threat, and I think this is partly why it hits the fear factor so high, is because it's not just one really scary looming threat throughout the whole thing. There is one of those from the beginning, but there are so many by the time you get towards the latter stages. There are threats from so many places, and they're all scary in their own right, in their own way. They all seem to want quite different things. And somehow everything's happening at once, and the epicenter is all in about the same place, and for the way it goes down, and how the thing is, it's not really even that everything happens at once. It sort of does, and it doesn't. It's actually quite hard to define that in its own way. But just, it's a lot all at once, and it's hard to process it all in a way which I think adds to that. It's just clever. And you do get this descent, this other tone of just this descent into madness, and it's not just Karina either. Like, she is not doing great at the beginning. She has problems, she's paranoid, she's all of these things. Over time, she does get worse with that in many ways. But she is very aware, and she is by no means the only one, that there are a lot of people who are, at the very least, in a similar space to her, if not worse, who, for a lot of them, were actually sort of fine at the beginning, and it does get this incredibly poignant sense of just, nothing is okay, actually, and nothing and no one is okay. And all of that together makes it quite grim, and there's a lot of grit and realism, and even outside of the main horror parts of the book and the sort of character stories, a lot of that is quite grim. I mean, talking about Emily and Wilbur, no matter how interesting and how clever all of that is, at the end of the day, that is a couple heading towards divorce. Like, it's pretty clear to see pretty early. Like, that's not exactly a happy story. And, you know, their teenage daughter being caught in the middle of that, and the sort of nature of this very strange town with some very strange happenings, and none of them seem to be all that pleasant. So, and also just Karina herself and what she's having to go through and deal with, psychologically and not. It all makes to be quite somber, I guess. And I don't know, I mean, I really like grief horror. It's not surprising that I like this sort of thing too. So the last things I like to talk about here on AER, and again, this is still going to be spoiler free, is some moments that inspire art, that are sort of art inspiring for me. I'm an artist, I do like to draw quite a lot, and also just some favourite moments to read. So in terms of art, I mean, it's worth noting that the cover of this book is fantastic. This is just like a really evocative cover, and it's also just really nicely put together. It's just genuinely a really good piece of art, so there's that. But also, it's worth mentioning that there are illustrations, a couple of illustrations of scarecrows in this book. And they're really good too. They're very evocative and very much what I was visualising. It was just nice to see that, honestly. And the description of the scarecrows, because they are described several times, they're very important, as well as the sort of art and sort of knowing, hey, yeah, I got the sort of right idea. I thought about drawing them, I still might, just because I've never drawn scarecrows before, that'd probably be pretty fun. But also, there's a party at a B&B, and there's mention of things like string lights and tables of food and things like that. It's all described suitably horrifically. Things like that. And it's very evocative. There are lots of different settings and bits of scenery you could draw, but something like that, with like the little details of string lights and things like that, I don't know, that wormed its way into my brain pretty strongly. In terms of my favourite moments to read about, there are very few of these I can mention without spoilers, and very few of these I could talk about without just talking about the entire book, honestly. The Intruder, both occasions of that, I really liked how that was handled and what actually happened there, because again, that whole exchange didn't necessarily go as I would expect it to. Especially not given the character who's involved in that. Well, all of the characters involved in that, but once pieces sort together, you do end up being surprised that some people do the things that they do. It's just in the heat of the moment, people don't always do the things you'd expect. And again, I appreciate this as well written, well done characters. Also, just the end of this book is just really good. It's a really good ending. It's very fitting, it ties things up nicely, not too much, because I really don't like it when every single end is tied. I don't like to be told absolutely everything, and I'm not here. I'm given enough of the big pieces, but that's about it. And I mentioned earlier how sort of post-ending, is everything okay, or is it very much not? And I appreciate that doubt, and I like that in an ending, that you get enough and it's fitting and it's satisfying, but not too much. Not too much that robs you of any imagination that you have. So last, but certainly not least, I like to give a rating out of 5 for each book that I do on AER. Is it surprising that it's getting a 5-star rating? I mean, really? I thought my read of 2025 was pretty set in stone. That was a book that I read pretty early in the year, and not much has come really even that close to it until now. This is up there. This is a really, really good book. It might well end up being my read of the year. It's that strong. Like, this is just a really well written book. It's a great story, great characters. I mean, there is very little I can fault in this book. Even if I wanted to, I would have a hard time. But yeah, this is a great book. I mean, that's the bottom line, and I hope I've inspired you to read it, because I think you'll really enjoy it, honestly. It's a horror book that's actually genuinely Terrifying. So link to get your copy will be in the description. As for what the next episode is and when it will be, I don't know. There's no schedule. But until next time, have a great rest of your day and happy reading.